It's time for Fresh Oil with singer-songwriter and pastor Keith Manley, a program designed to minister the gospel of God's grace and to bring fresh oil to the brokenhearted. And now, with today's program, Pastor Keith Manley.
Hello, friend. Welcome to Fresh Oil. I'm Keith Manley. I'm reading today from Habakkuk chapter 2. One of the Old Testament prophets, beginning with verse 2, he says, "Then the Lord replied, Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, he is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous will live by his faith." To me, the prophet Habakkuk is one of the most interesting prophets of the Old Testament. He starts out in chapter 1 by saying the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. Now, an oracle is not a common word we use every day. I think it's a computer company I see advertised on TV. But I looked up the definition of the word oracle, and the best definition is probably it's a divine announcement, an announcement from God. You know, in Amos chapter 3 and verse 7, it says, "Surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets." I know we're living in an age where a lot of people claim to be prophets, claim to be hearing from God. And maybe some of them are, but many of them are not. But Habakkuk was divinely called and was definitely a prophet of God. In chapter 1, Habakkuk begins to pour out his complaint to God. Do you ever complain to God? I'm sure I have a number of times. And I love the fact that God allowed him to do this. In verse 2 of chapter 1, he says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, and there is strife and conflict abounds." And then comes the therefore. "Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted." Sounds a lot like the day in which we live today, where there's violence in the land, and sometimes you can wonder if justice is really perverted. Now, after pouring out his complaint to God, God answers Habakkuk. And in verse 5, he said, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." I believe God might be saying that again today. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. Because I believe God is going to do something in these days that we might find it hard to believe. Now, friend, we are living in some perilous times. Times where God is shaking the nations. Times when God is shaking the church world. Major scandals are happening and very well-known pastors are falling. You know, I have gone to Israel a number of times, usually every year. And now the Middle East is shaking because God is doing something. He's sending a message to the world that we're living in the final hours of humanity when I believe Jesus Christ is coming back. Now, when you receive a vision from God or a dream from God or a desire that God puts in your heart, what is the path of that vision or that dream? What can you expect to go through when God puts something in your heart that he says is going to happen or he wants you to do? I believe the first step is it begins with a burden. And when you look here at Habakkuk, he tells us three things about a burden. A burden can be seen, a burden can be heard, and a burden can be felt. In the King James, verse 1 said, "The burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see." Instead of using the word oracle, he called it a burden. Now, what is a burden? A burden can be a heavy load. It's something you carry. Sometimes it's on the outside, and sometimes you carry it on the inside. Perhaps it's a burden for your family. Perhaps you're a watchman and it's a burden for this nation and you're concerned about our world and our in Washington, D.C. or the state in which you live. Perhaps it's a burden for the starving people, Uganda, Africa, All across the world, there are people that are hurting. But nonetheless, a burden can be seen, it can be felt, and it can be heard. You see, when you get a vision from God, and I'm not talking about a mystical vision, I'm just talking about something that God puts in your spirit that you see. When you get a vision from God, you begin to feel it. You begin to hear it. You see, then God transfers it from being a burden to a vision. Look at chapter 2. In verse 2 of chapter 2 in Habakkuk, he says, "And the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. And then the Lord replied, Write down the revelation," the NIV says, "and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it." See, God is saying here, you take the vision and you write it down. You want to make it clear. Why did God say this? Because a lot of people talk about vision, what they want to do, what they feel God is asking them to do, but they don't understand. God likes things to be plain. He doesn't mumble. He's very clear. So when you get this direction from God, write it down. And then secondly, in verse 3, he said, "For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay." Wait for it. That's the second point. It begins with a burden or a vision, and then you have to wait for it. I have often said that 90% of the time when we miss it with God, it's in this area of timing. You see, we operate in the realm of time. Everything, we measure it in time. But with God, God operates in the realm of eternity. The Bible said with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. And sometimes when God doesn't make things happen on our timetable, we get upset. Let me tell you something very important about a vision or revelation from God. They tend to linger. They tend to take a while to come to pass. They don't happen on your timetable. They happen on God's timetable. Between the time that God gives you this burden, this vision, this dream, and the time it comes to pass, there is a time period there, a time of waiting. Let me tell you something about the lingering process. Number one, you don't cave in and give up or throw in the towel just because it hasn't happened yet. Secondly, when God truly gives you a vision or a dream, it's going to happen regardless. It will happen because God said it would. And then thirdly, He may have to get another dreamer if you don't cooperate and obey Him, but God will fulfill His purpose, and He'll bring about what He wants to happen. And this is the journey of the vision. Perhaps you're listening to Fresh Oil today and you're thinking to yourself, Keith, God spoke something in my heart, and I have a dream, I have a passion, I have a desire, but man, it's not happening. And I just don't know if it's going to happen. No, friend, the vision lingers. It's waiting for an appointed time, is what God said. See, the timing belongs to God and not us. So the vision begins with this burden, and then you wait for it. And then what do you do with it? Then you run with it. You run with the vision. God told the prophet Habakkuk, He said, you get this vision or this burden, then you write it down. He said, make it clear. And then what does God say? Then He says you run with it. Once you write it down and you're waiting for it, then you got to run with it. Go about your life as though it's already happened. Believe it. Know for certainty that what God promised, it'll come to pass. Sometimes you have to fight for the vision. Sometimes you have to guard it and you have to grab a hold of it. I have found sometimes that people that surround us can many times crush our dreams and crush our vision. But God says, hold on to it. Write it down. Know for a certainty that if I promised it, I'm going to do it. And then you got to run with it. By the way, sometimes there can be 3 steps to a vision. You have the birth of the vision, and then there are times when you have the death of a vision, and then you have the resurrection of the vision. Now, let me talk about that for a minute. The birth of a vision, how wonderful this step is when you get that inspiration or that revelation from God. As a songwriter, I know this very well. When I get the passion or the inspiration for a song, I'm sometimes sitting there and I'm like, I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I definitely feel God speaking to me in this song. So you have the birth of a vision. And you know, the birth of a vision is not unlike the birth of a baby. It's a blessed time. It feels good. It's the honeymoon. She is so wonderful. You're buying her candy and flowers. She's making you dinner and lighting the candles. But then all of a sudden, the candlelight gives way to daylight, and you don't like the thing you're married to. And then comes step 2 of a vision, the death of a vision. Things aren't quite what they used to be. You don't feel quite the same as you used to feel, and reality has set in. If it's your business vision, all of a sudden you realize that the net sales are not equaling the accounts payable. Just having your name on the sign is not getting the bills paid. And listen, this is where most people quit. Whether it's the vision of your business or even the vision of marriage, there comes that death of a vision. But hold on, step 3 is coming. Step 3 is the resurrection of the vision. Jesus spoke about this in John 12 and verse 24. This is what he said. I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. See, during the death of a vision, what you've received from God gets purified. It dies to the flesh. It dies to myself. I realize that it's not something I can do in myself. I need God's help in this. But when it's resurrected, it becomes fruitful. See, during the death of a vision, what you've received from God, it gets purified. You don't quit just because your business is not successful. You don't quit just because you have problems in the marriage or she burnt the meal. You don't quit because the marriage is not what it used to be. No, you make it better than it used to be. Let's look at this process of the birth and death and resurrection of a vision. The example, Jesus. When Jesus was born, Emmanuel, the angels sang and the shepherds rejoiced. But then came the death of a vision. He had to go to the cross. But thank God it didn't end at the cross. Then came the morning. After 3 days and 3 nights, at God's appointed time, the vision rose again. And Jesus was victorious over death, hell, and the grave. Abraham had a vision. God said, Abe, look up into the stars and count them if you indeed can. He gives him a vision for what would begin as a family and then move to becoming a great nation. A few chapters later, he's climbing the mountain. He's drawing back the knife to slay his son. See, the vision was born. Isaac was there. But now God says the vision has to die. And Abe climbs the mountain. He takes his son, and he's getting ready to sacrifice him. And then comes the resurrection of the vision. He hears the ram caught in the thicket, and God provides himself a sacrifice. See, God gave this promise to Abraham in Genesis 12. He said, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I'll bless those that bless you, and curse whoever curses you, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Great word, right? No mention of a son, just a nation. And then Abraham goes through the pain of separation from his nephew Lot. God had to show him that the promise was not going to come through a nephew. It was going to come just the way God promised it. Sarah messed it up, and she had Hagar go in with Abraham, and they gave birth to Ishmael, but that was not God's plan. But then God said in Genesis 17, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. It doesn't happen until chapter 21, when they give birth to Isaac. Now Abraham's 100 years old, and now God resurrects the vision. I don't know what God has promised you, friend. I don't know what he's spoken in your heart, but I can tell you this, it will surely come to pass, whatever the Lord has promised you. So we're talking today about the journey of a vision, what it is you're believing God for. Thank you for joining me today on Fresh Oil, neighbor. Walk in grace. God loves you unconditionally.
Thanks for joining us today for Fresh Oil with Pastor Keith Manley. Fresh Oil is an outreach of Grace Family Church in Rockford, Illinois, and can be heard each weekday at this same time. You can reach us online at weneedgod.com. Until next time, remember, God's love for you is unconditional, and He He makes His mercies new every morning.